And we are back. So welcome everybody. If you didn't see the pre-show, my name is MPA. I am from Waves, and I have the pleasure of being with my great friend and amazing mastering engineer for this Waves Open Sessions, Piper Payne. Piper, hi again. How are you?
Hey, Michael. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Waves. Thanks, Michael, for hosting this.
You are more than welcome. So for those of you who may be wondering how this is going to work, let me just reiterate. The first half of this Waves Open session is going to be tips and tricks with Piper about when you are working on your own music. We're all in lockdown right now, so there's a lot of us working on our music at home. And what we can do to work better on our music and master our music ourselves if we need to. The second half of this is going to be dealing with me picking Piper's brain and asking a lot of your questions about how to prepare your music to work with a genius such as Piper Payne. Now, the song that she is using today, if you saw, I explained, but if you're late, I'll let you know. This is one of my own songs, so I feel like Piper's about to crucify me for a bunch of things that I might have done wrong, but I'm going to check with her and see how did I do?
I think you did pretty well, Michael.
Okay,
Pretty
so
at least.
So first up, so let's go into talking first about mastering your own music. I mean, obviously, in this day and age, wherever so many people are working in the box, obviously, you have gear. If you haven't noticed on the screen, we can see Piper's face. We can also see her hands on her console. So at some point, I'm going to be muting her microphone so that she can do her thing and we don't get bleed back. So Piper, let's talk about mastering your own music. Is it a possibility first? And let's talk about some of the things that may come into play when you want to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, being a mastering engineer and working for a lot of independent artists, as well as major label artists, here at Infrasonic, we understand that not every single project is going to go to a pro mastering engineer, and that's okay. I think a lot of what you can gain by some simple critical listening, references, and a few simple tools in the digital domain, you can kind of achieve what would be a good sounding master to go out into the world. We have to keep in mind that not everybody can afford to master every project, and not everybody can afford a whole room full of gear like this. So keeping that in mind. I think that Waves, of course, has a lot of great tools for mastering your own music if you have to. The one thing I will say, though, is that the reason why mastering engineers and the mastering process still exists is because it's about quality control and about format conversion, taking a whole bunch of songs that were usually recorded in lots of different places, getting them ready to go out into the world in one cohesive album, one thing that really goes together, meshes, so that you don't have to turn the level up and down when you're listening, driving down the road. But if you can keep those things in mind and reconcile the fact that you may not have another person for perspective actually working on the music, but maybe you could talk to friends or other trusted ears about what your masters are sounding like, and make sure that you are using the tools that are available to you, but not overusing them, not abusing them. We're going to go into a little bit about what I think is a little too much on mastering with plugins. And then lastly, keeping in mind that a mastering studio really is about having a different listening space and a different set of ears on the project. And if you're mastering your own stuff at home, I would suggest you take some time off of it after the mixing process, because if you just put a bunch of plugins on the master bus right after you're done mixing it, you're not really mastering it. You're just sort of making it maybe louder, or maybe compensating for things that you should have fixed in the mix.
So my first question to you is about time spent listening. And I think I've seen a few people ask this question. By the way, guys, if you see me look left and down, it's because that's where I'm seeing all the questions that are coming through to me from someone who's looking at all your questions. So I'm not being rude and I'm not hating on Piper. One of the questions I've seen a lot is about ear fatigue. How how, I mean, one of the things that I think I breached on a bit in the beginning when I was talking about preparing my session is sometimes you can listen to something at 3 o'clock in the morning and then you go to sleep and you think it sounded amazing, but you go in the next day and it sounds absolutely woefully, painfully awful, and you want to go and hide in a hole for the rest of your life. What's that
Yeah.
about, and how do you deal with something like that when you've got to try and make a cohesive project out of a bunch of different songs that you're doing yourself?
Well, I mean, when we think about why ear fatigue exists, it's because your ears are tired. And a lot of times when we're working in headphones, or working on, you know, I'll just say it, subpar converters that are making your brain work harder to hear fidelity in the music, then not only are your ears getting tired because they're getting blown, like blown out, and then you're going to start compensating by raising the high end as your high end starts to decrease and your ears start to feel like everything sounds really dull, so I'm going to boost up the top end. Or if you're listening for too loud too long, you can experience ear fatigue. If you work in a studio that is beautifully designed acoustically and you have a full range system that is set up the way that you want it, I mean, we sit and master records here for 8-10 hours some days, and back to back records if we have to. And a lot of that's just about having a system that is generally not fatiguing to begin with. But if you feel like you're starting to get tired, get up, walk out of the room, get a coffee, take a break. Nobody actually sits and works in a studio for 10 hours straight at 90, 88, 90 dB SPL, without having some ear fatigue happening, or starting to lose their hearing after a while. And so for me, I say use a system that is hopefully not fatiguing to begin with. So make sure that your speakers are set up properly if you're working on speakers. If you're working on headphones, take them off for a while, or listen on lower levels when you're just capturing the mix or listening back. And that's just good practice anyway, because when you lower the level, the other things that you don't hear when it's loud pop out. And when you raise the level, other things that you didn't hear when it was quiet, those will pop out too. So I would say, take breaks, listen at responsible levels, and listen on a system that's hopefully not fatiguing. So not
Right.
earbuds, you over the ear headphones if you can.
That's one of the
And
things. It's actually one of my pet peeves, and I think it's only one of my pet peeves because I've been in this industry for so many damn years. But I think a lot of people these days, when they're starting out, actually try to mix their music on the headphones that came with their smartphone. And those are not good headphones to work on. But it's like so much of the stuff that we listen to on a daily basis now are smartphone headphones. So that's bad, right? Right?
kind of, yeah, I'll say it. If you if you're working on music that is got your reputation on it, I don't care if you listen to iTunes walking down the street on your little earbuds, that's fine. But you know what, those things will damage your hearing and you're not going to be working for very long. And they're not going to tell you what you really need to hear, and it's going to be really, really difficult to achieve a good sounding mix on anything. That'll sound good on anything but those headphones if you're mixing on them. So a good pair of over the ear cans, open back, if you have a quiet environment to work in, is I believe is always better than closed. But a decent pair of headphones is really going to be cheaper than some of those Bluetooth earbuds,
Yeah. I got a question
and
here
less
from.
fatiguing.
Yeah, absolutely less fatiguing. I've got a question here from Domin, and Domin, I hope I got your name right. We Australians suck at pronouncing things. How about mastering with small near field monitors that are standing pretty close to you?
Mm. Um, I would say if it's a system that you know really well, then it's okay in general. I like PMC speakers. I have the big giant PMC speakers. I have a small set of near field PMC speakers. I've got other speakers that I've learned and know well over the years. If it gives you something that approaches full range, or you can supplement with a really well-tuned sub in the system, then I don't think there's anything wrong with mastering on near fields. In fact, I mean, like a pair of Meyer HD1s with a sub is one of the best sounding mastering systems I've ever heard. A lot of it is room dependent, and a lot of it is how you have it set up, and having the ability as you're learning that system to be able to check the sound of your recorded files out in the world and make sure that they hold up out there. Because one of the things that I know and feel good about as a mastering engineer is that I've sat in front of this pair of speakers for so many thousands of hours that I know them intimately, and I know that when I raise 200 hertz in this room, I know what that sounds like out of this room. And when I raise 5K or lower 5K in this room or do something to the weird to the sides, I know what that's going to sound like translating out of this room. And that's just part of the, putting in the 10,000 hours to become an expert in your field. But, if you're working on your own music, I'd say if it sounds good and it sounds good on as many systems as you can get, objectively, then you're probably okay.
Okay, cool, beautiful. Now, Kenneth just asked a question about finding good quality reference tracks. Kenneth, we're going to get to that in the next half. Right now, we're going to keep on focusing on tools and ideas and the concept of what to do when you're trying to master your own stuff. Okay, so let's get to a bit of music if we can. This in front of me, in front of the world, is one of my songs. It's called Frozen, and Piper asked me for a vocal up, a vocal down, and an instrumental. Now, Piper, let's for a second imagine that I was doing this myself. What advice could you give me on a couple of plugins and tips on where I should aim, or where people should aim to try and work out how to go through this process? Should it actually be on the same session that is the entire session, or should it be like this as just a stereo file so that you're just focusing on one thing for starters? That's a good question to start with.
I like that question, Michael. Thanks for asking. I think that the beauty of the mastering process, as I said a minute ago, is about having a little bit more perspective and kind of taking that 30,000 foot view. And so for me, if I were to master something that I mixed, which by the way, I don't really mix records anymore. It's not my forte. I'm not that good at it. I'm much better at mastering records. So I leave the mixing to the mixers and hopefully mastering to the mastering engineers. But if I were to say mix or master something that I mix, I would absolutely be outputting stereo files, or at the very least, basic stems, instrumental and a cappella, to then take it into another session just to give me even more perspective. Because if you're like me, the first thing you're going to do is hear something that you don't like and then want to go back to the mix to fix it. And most of the time that's going to be within the first minute of the song. And then you're not going to finish the other 2 or 3 minutes of the song. You're just going to over tweak the first minute. And then you end up with a song that ends up not really going anywhere or feels a little bit lifeless. So I would say put it out into a stereo file or an instrumental a cappella or a couple of stems and master it in another session.
So one of the things that I like to do before you go is like when I'm mixing a session, you missed it at the beginning, you could see it, but I was showing how I create a vocal bus and a vocal VCA, and then I create a music bus and a music VCA, and I always create both. So that way with the VCA, I can pull things up and down evenly rather than just a volume knob. But one of the things I also like to do, and I'd love your feedback on it because I know some other people who do as well, is I always make sure that when my effects are all mixed in, that they're all going to the bus that the music is on, and the vocals are only going to the vocal bus. So that way, if I turn off the vocals, the effects might still be there, as in the reverb, etc., in the background, but the main vocal is gone. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, if you have the vocal reverbs in the instrumental, then it's often not going to be counted as an instrumental. And one of the things that we forget about is that, yes, effects that are not intelligible vocals or don't have words in them are not really vocal effects. But when you're looking into sync opportunities for licensing your music for visual media, there is often a request for an instrumental version of the song, and in that case, you need to have it without any vocals, including
Okay.
reverbs.
Well, there you go. Luckily,
So
I had a
that's one
vocal
way to do it.
effects group as well, so I could pull that down as well.
Yes, that's what I would suggest doing is to mute the vocal effects group.
All right, so okay, roast me. How did I do here?
Well, Michael, as you know, I don't really like to roast meat so much. I like to smoke it. So I'm gonna barbecue you instead of roast you.
Okay.
So sorry, you'll see me look up a lot because the screen is kind of up higher than what this particular camera is. So forgive me, I'm not ignoring you. I'm just paying attention to the screen here.
Knock yourself out. I'm looking down. You're looking up.
Can you see this screen? Okay.
Yes, I can see my song as a green and orange wave file.
Look at that. So the blue, the aquamarine blue green down here on this in this pane is the mix. So these are the mixes that you sent me, and you can actually see that I lowered the level a little bit across the board here because you were normalized to the top, and the system here, the way that I have it calibrated, likes to see a peak really no hotter than -3. And every engineer works differently, but for the most part, that's where I'll start, is to have it normalizing or peaking around -3 before I'll actually run it out onto the console. And then from there, we have more controls to be able to raise or lower the level. But we're talking about mastering stuff in the box at home, quarantine style mixing and mastering right now. So I'm not even going to talk about the console until later in this presentation. This area down here is the mix. This area up here, the kind of neon green, is where the master will be recorded back in. One thing I will say, and this is part of the reason why I say bring it into a new session, is because even if you are mastering fully in the box, you really ought to let the music play through so you can hear how the master sounds across the whole song. In mastering, we don't do a ton of automating. Like, I won't say like, the verses, I'll, boost the sub by 5 dB and then bring it back down for the chorus or something crazy like that. But once in a while, we might do a little bit of volume automation on the actual different sections of the song, but that's also kind of rare. So when you think about doing a master, you're doing an EQ or a dynamics process for the whole song for the most part. And in that case, you need to hear what that sounds like across the entire song, not just listen to a verse, listen to a chorus. So when I do that, even if I'm working fully in the box, which happens sometimes, even though I have a big mastering room to work in, all kinds of equipment I could ever want. Sometimes some projects require an in the box mastering process because of a million different reasons, but I will always watch the recording come through on the master input track. So no like set it and forget it and get up and walk away. I will sit down and listen to the whole thing all the way through because it's just best practices. And most of our job as mastering engineers is quality control, to make sure that there are no errors, no issues with the files. Make sure you're getting, the best sounding recording of this master you can. So what you gave me here is an
Too
instrumental.
What I gave you is too hot.
A little hot. Even though the song's called Frozen, you gave me something a little hot.
I did.
So you gave me an instrumental, which was awesome. You gave me a full version with the master dynamics process taken off. You gave me a full version with the master dynamics process that you were listening to, pretending that you are, sending this off to a client, or you are the client. You gave me a vocal up version, no dynamics process, and a vocal up version with dynamics process. The reason why this is cool to have is because I like to know what you've been listening to, so I don't give you back something that is completely weird or foreign to you. What I think sounds good and what you think sounds good might be completely different. That doesn't mean we can't work together. It just means that we have to come up with a language and understand what each of us thinks is quality. And a good mastering engineer or a good mixing engineer should be able to come together and make the best sounding project possible.
But
So
also, hold on just 1 second before you go on. So also, if you're mastering your own stuff and you do this for yourself, this actually gives you a really good visual as well as audible about what, reminding yourself what you're listening to, but by the looks of what I'm seeing here.
Yeah. And that's, that brings me back to what I usually say is listen with your eyes. If the waveform looks loud, it's definitely loud. I'm just kidding. That was a complete joke. Please don't listen to that.
Your jokes.
So that, that is something that can, you can run into issues though, is sometimes I have clients that say, well, this one looks louder. Well, it actually might not be, because the dynamics available, like these, the difference between the loudest instances and the quieter instances, that's really where things are measurably loud. You can't have quiet without loud, and you can't have loud without quiet. And so having something that is, quote, loud throughout the entire track, it might measure really loud, but it's never going to feel as big and dynamic and beautiful as something with real dynamics in it.
Right.
So even down to instantaneous dynamics like this, or program dynamics, which are really beautiful. Michael, you did a good job with that, from the intro to the verses to the choruses to this interlude thing to to the outro areas. Yeah, you did a great job there.
It's a very strange song, this one. It covers like 3 different genres.
3? That's it? I think it's a lot more than that, but
I think it is, but it all has the same melody.
Other thing to keep in mind too is, mastering engineers, we have never, for the most part, heard this song before it hits our desk. Once in a while, we'll give it a quick listen and make sure if the mixing engineer or the artist is worried about something in their mix, we'll listen to it and say, yeah, the bass is fine, or no, there's something up with the vocal. Can you look at this? Can you look at this level issue or whatever? But for the most part, we are just seeing it for the first time. And that is one of the strengths of the mastering process. And so again, if you're working on this yourself, hopefully you've taken a couple of weeks off of it, taken a little bit of time away, and you come back to it and you have a fresh set of ears on it. So the first thing I did was I verified the integrity of the file. And Michael, one thing you did, and I was going to wait to smoke you on this, is that you sent me a 16-bit mix.
Sorry.
Yeah. Send me a 24-bit mix next time, okay?
And even if you're doing it for yourself, you should bounce it off as 24-bit.
24-bit or higher, yeah. And the reason is because in a 16-bit mix, you have 96 dB of dynamic range. So the quietest to the loudest, and that's as much impact as you can possibly get. Whereas if you go into 24-bit, you have 144 dB of dynamic range. And that means that your louds can be louder because your softs are softer. I know it sounds super weird, and it's kind of like a little bit of a weird way to think about it, but really a 24-bit mix or 24-bit wave file will give you 16.7 million ways for the computer to describe that one sample. So even though it's 48 kilohertz, each sample has a whole bunch of information stored in it. So a 24-bit mix will give you 16.7 million ways for the computer to describe it, whereas a 16-bit file, computer only has 65,000-ish ways of describing that one sample. So it's going to come down to the resolution of your reverb sounds. It's going to come down to the air in the vocal. It's going to come down to how cleanly your fades are being expressed. Things like that. That's really, really important for you to be submitting 24-bit mixes to your mastering engineers, please, or master it at 24-bit yourself, please. Most distribution services will accept the 24-bit WAV file. There are only a few that are hopefully going to update that sometime soon that will accept only a 16-bit.
Okay, cool. So that's a good thing. So if you're mastering this yourself, which is what we're working on, make sure that you're sending the right thing to the right people. Okay. So this song starts really quiet, and then it gets a bit louder, and then it goes into some crazy drums and some rap. Where do you want to start? I mean, where would you start with plugins if you wanted to master this yourself?
Well, you start at the very beginning. Very good place to start. So what I would say is I'm going to get my little playhead ready, and I'm just going to choose. I've already gone through these and made sure that this is the one I want to start with, but I think that the mix that you made was like vocal down or vocal normal, is where I want to start, and with no master compression. So I'm going to start at the beginning. I'm going to start playing it. So you ready for some music?
Yeah, do you want me to mute your microphone, or do you want to put your headphones on?
I'm going to put my headphones on now.
Okay, cool.
So for the moment, I'm going to be working on this in headphones so that it mimics hopefully a little bit more like what you all will be working on at home. And then once we go to break it out on the console, I'll listen on the speakers. So here we go. I'm going to start at the beginning. I think I've got a delay, so I'm just going to have it here.
The music of this dance is the well-known two-step.
Don't say goodbye. Don't make me cry. Oh, fading again, but I won't give in.
I'm a huge fan of pads.
Yeah, so it's beautiful. It's a beautiful, luscious arrangement. Already you can tell, and it's really well balanced, I think. What we would do usually is sit and just listen to the whole song all the way through, or jump around a little bit and give us a good example or a good idea of what's happening in the mix. But the first thing I'm going to do is go find also one of the louder sections of the song and see if I can figure out what's going on in the bass, because we haven't really heard a lot of bass yet. But I want to start there. And then next thing I'm going to do is go listen to how the vocal presentation works, because in my experience and what I like is checking out what's happening overall, get a super quick understanding of what the song is what's going on, what the song's about. And then from there, pay attention, hone in on bass, which is the foundation of the mix and the master. And
Right.
then pay attention to the vocal, because without the vocal in a vocal song, you don't really, it's not, if you don't nail that, you don't get that right, there's not really any point to it.
Right.
So I'm going to go just kind of skip around so that the listeners can hear what else is happening in this mix.
No worries. Go.
Okay.
I'm shaking, skills that I
Okay. And then we got this little bridge.
Yeah, these man know what they're talking about.
Got some cool samples happening here. It's a nice
Actually,
big wide.
we're going to talk about that in a minute. By the way, Gordon and a few other people, you asked about bass. This is we are technically answering your question here, so I'm not ignoring you.
Okay, and then we go into another big build up out here. Pardon me, that's an outro. Ooh, and now for something completely different. So this is a really cool song, Michael, and kind of a challenge to master. I'm so glad that you sent me this one. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind here, and anyone who's ever seen me speaking about mastering out in the world will know that the first thing that I always do is take an inventory of what is in this song. And so for anybody that's that I would usually be calling on out in the audience, the first thing I want you to do is pay attention. What's in the song? I'm hearing pads, vocals, kick drums, a lot of reverb, some delays, a ton of crazy percussion, a little jingly sound, kick drum, snare drum, what sounds like, some cool, cool toms that sound like a little bit of like a world music sample of some sort.
I call them my Peter Gabriel toms.
your Peter Gabriel toms. So all that stuff, I have to keep that in mind and know what's in there so that when I start turning knobs and start, dealing with some EQ or compression, I'm not going to mess up what's there to begin with, because first rule is like, do no harm. Don't mess up the mix for the sake of making a master. Okay. So first thing I want to do is check on what is going on in the intro and then what's going on in the outro. I want to find a good place where I'm able to get a handle on the bass, because for me, in this song, I think the bass is really, really important. You've got a lot of kick drums. You have some, some electric bass sound. You have bass in the pads, and the vocal has a really beautiful chest voice that I don't want to hurt in order to bring out a little bit more of the foundation of the mix. So first thing I'm going to do is I've got already pulled up a few things to be able to check out on this mix, and I'm going to first unbypass this little plugin chain I've got here. Now, all of these are currently off and not being used. So I'm only going to turn them on as we go. So I'm going to start with a little multiband love. And I will say this over and over and over again. A lot of times in mastering, we use multi-stage compression and multi-stage dynamics processing. You can tell right here, I'm only using 2 bands of this multiband. Linear phase multiband plugin. I am not going to be using all of them. Just because they're there doesn't mean you need to use all of them. I'm really just trying to get a little bit more evenness, because I'm feeling like the area around 250 is feeling a little bit sometimes unwieldy, and then at other times a little bit anemic. So I'm just trying to even that out a little bit. And then the really like the gut punch of like 100 to 120 is also feeling like it's really big at times, but then sometimes missing. So again, trying to even that out as well. And so that's why I'm using this tool. And I have no problem anytime you want to use a tool, or you want to use any sort of process on a mix or a master, go for it, have fun, but also be able to maybe explain why to yourself or to someone else who might ask, hey Piper, why'd you use that multiband? Well, those are the reasons. So I'm going to pop that in, and I'm just going to do a little bit of work just to show you what we're hearing on those low end elements. And that's this. So I've basically pulled this up to be able to show how to even out that bass a little bit. So I'm going to play a section here, and it'll probably repeat. Here we go.
I think a lot of people forget about the solo bands feature in the linear phase.
Yeah. So I'm also gonna turn this on and off a couple times so you can hear. It's off. So the level will jump a little bit because I compensated for how much gain I added in this band. I pulled that down a little bit, so you'll see that jump a little. That's okay. When working in the box, it's really, really hard sometimes to be able to compensate for the differences. And so you don't want to fool yourself by thinking, oh, that's louder, so it must be better. If you can find a way to compensate for any EQ adds or dynamics gain adds that you're using, find a way to listen to the mix at the similar or same level. So maybe even take down the level of the master output until you're really ready to start doing some proper A/B comparison. Okay, Michael, any questions so far?
We've got a few. There are a few questions, but I'm gonna hold on. One question that I did want to get to, Simming, is we've already talked about 24-bit and how much I let you down in that regard. Denny says, if I didn't record at 24-bit, is it okay to mix it out at 24-bit?
Yes, absolutely. All you're going to be doing is adding padding zeros so that any processing that you're doing in the digital domain will now have more availability for math. It's kind of like my car can only go to 65 miles an hour, but like, can I drive in a highway that's 70 miles an hour allowed? Yeah, absolutely. It just
Right.
it gives your computer more room to work.
Okay, one more question before we
And this
move
is
on.
different, by the way, than like 32 or 64-bit processing that the workstations are doing or the plugins are doing. This is a different thing. This is PCM audio.
Right, exactly. So Daniel wants to know how much of a difference in relative volume would you recommend in the vocal tracks for a vocal up or vocal down mix like I provided?
I would say a dB to a dB and a half should give you enough room to work. We're not looking for like 4, 5, 6 dB difference. This is just, it's meant to be like a subtle thing, like a heard, felt not heard kind of thing, almost like it just gives me a little bit more room to work. If you give me if you give the engineer a vocal up mix by a dB or a dB and a half, it means that we can deal with the sides in a different way without hurting the vocal. It's just sort of like clears out a little bit of space to work. And sometimes it ends up being that this track ends up sounding a little bit bigger and sort of wraps around you a little bit nicer without having to use stereo width knobs.
Right. Penny wants to know, what do you recommend? When would you recommend using 32-bit float? Like in Pro Tools, you can use, you can.
Anytime, anytime it's available to you, and anytime that your computer can output that. Again, it just is more padded zeros, gives you your computer more room to do that processing, without ending up with artifacts or aliasing coming down into the audible spectrum.
All right, folks. I know there's a ton of questions, and I know a lot of you are asking about Piper's headphone preferences and what she does. We will get to those. Let's keep on going on this for now. Now, interestingly enough, the Abbey Road TG mastering stereo, you missed it at the beginning, Piper, but this was actually the compressor that I had on the mix when I gave you this mix with no compression. That's the one I took off, the TG mastering stereo.
This one that we're going to put right back on?
That's the one right there. You know how to use it better than I do, probably.
Well, I figured it out so far over the last year. So the reason I like this, and this is not the next thing I'm going to do, actually, just so you know, this is not the next process, although it is next in line in this list here. This I'm using mostly as a little bit of color, because if you're working in the box, a lot of times your masters can come out feeling a little bit sterile. And I think that this particular plugin does a really great job of giving some vibe and giving a ton of flexibility. It's not just like a blanket, analog warmth sound or whatever that means to you. It's just that it has a lot of really cool features that I think are awesome to use if you're mastering in the box, such as this mono sum, or only listening to the mid or the side, or isolating the left and the right if you need to, things like that. Those are tools that I have in a hardware version on the console sitting right in front of me here that are hard to find in digital plugins. So that's not the thing I'm going to go to next, though. The thing I'm going to go to next is to my EQ. So this is a linear phase EQ that I'm going to make sure, number one, that I have compensated for a little bit of level adjustment after any gain additions that I've made. And I'm going to now even out the rest of the frequency spectrum that I've technically messed up by putting this multiband compressor on. Okay,
so there's a question that somebody's asked about the Lins straight away. Yeah. Gordon is one of them. There's a few people who have said dither is turned on both of them. Is that important?
It is important to me because I've listened to this particular plugin a bunch of times with and without dither, and I think personally that this plugin sounds better with dither on. And also because this mix has enough level where if I'm adding a lot of gain, which in mastering, you can see right here, I mean, the adjustments I'm making are nothing more than, 3.5 dB. And that's a subtraction. I mean, I'm not adding even more than a dB and a half. And so what I think is that any extra noise that you're adding with the random noise of dither is going to be so far out of the audio spectrum. But any issues with errors that the CPU is going to make, or any issues with math or algorithm errors, and it's going to kind of smooth that stuff out. And so I think these plugins sound better with dither.
All right.
Okay. So next step here is now to give back a little bit of that low end. So when you're doing that, when you do this multiband situation in these bottom two bands, we're actually going to be pulling down a little bit of level in the low end. We're not adding a lot. I'm just trying to control that and even it out. Okay. I'm not trying to give it that much more. So I'm going to give back a little bit of low end here. And then I'm also going to pull down a little bit right above the area where my multiband was. And the reason for that is because this cue, and the reason why multiband compressors are really dangerous is because this filter here has basically a ripple out through the frequency spectrum. This is not a hard and fast, only around these specific frequencies does this multiband compressor do anything. And so what a byproduct of the way that I found that this setting works the best to show off the low end and low mid of Michael's mix is that it actually is hurting some of the other instruments just above that frequency. So I am actually pulling down a little bit of this low mid area around 280 and then giving back a little bit more weight around 430. So let's give these a quick listen so you can actually hear them. This with and without this EQ, same section.
The world is in your eyes.
Okay, so it just kind of fills it out a little bit. And then I also found that some of the percussion was feeling like it was competing a little bit with the vocal. So I just pulled out a little tiny bit around 4,500 hertz to just clean that up a little bit. So I'm not having to strive so hard to listen over the sound of that to hear what she's saying in the vocal. Okay.
Yeah, it's a subtle difference, but it's an amazing difference.
Well, thanks. I'm glad you can hear it. So then the next section here is actually, I've got this bugger. Now, again, we go back to this thing. It's a really, really powerful plugin. One of the things I love about it is that you can reorder. You can order or reorder these sections. You can also get under the hood. So this little switch right there gives me a ton of different controls, and you can MS, you can do left and right, you can do stereo, you can link it, you can use or not use the sidechain, which I usually do. And then over here, you have these really cool tape emulations for different EQs. And so I personally felt like the mid, you can see I'm working in MS here. So the mid felt like it needed a little bit of low end love, a little bit of extra low end. And anyone who's worked in tape before will know that 15 IPS will often give you a little bit more bass, but it also will give you more noise. So I kind of like that in the mid. It gives the breath a little bit more like love as well, like so you can kind of hear her breathing a little bit better as a byproduct of the tape hiss that's adding. And then on the sides, you'll also know that 7.5 will often present as a little bit of a brighter sound on that speed. So I'm gonna give a little tiny bit of love to the sides and kind of open that up a hair. And then I'm going to go compensate over here again, because in mastering, what we know is that anything that I do here, I might have to take back a one step, kind of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back over and over and over again. Everything's a compromise in mastering. It's all in stages too. So I might compensate by giving us a little bit more on the mid, and then so that I can have a little bit more like foundation in the center of this mix, thinking like, oh, once it goes out into the world, like on small speakers or playing on a really like low quality encoder, then it's not going to sound as good if the mid is not anchored properly. Like the sides don't show up properly on small speakers or on bad encoding.
Right.
So
I have a question. There's actually a few people asking about the multiband compression before the EQ and why you would compress before EQ or compress after EQ. Jane Piper just asked pretty much the same question. Is like, what's your thinking on what comes first? And in this case, is this a chain of events that goes one into the other into the other?
this is a chain of events that goes one into the other into the other. Like a mastering console, it's done in series, not in parallel. So the reason why I like to have have a multiband at first, if I'm going to use a multiband at all, I will say that 99% of the time it's going to be the first thing in the chain, if not maybe a de-esser ahead of it, or even a high frequency limiter ahead of it, just in case I need that. But for anything that I'm doing that's going to be a multiband situation in the bass, I want that bass to be as, what's the best word? Like as virgin as possible, because I don't want anything else messing with the phase or the transient relationship in the bass between those different bands. I want it to be as clean and open sounding as possible. And I find that that's the best way for me anyway to get a good sound when using a multiband, is just to use it, number one, sparingly, number two, only use the bands you absolutely need, and then number three, use it first in the chain so that it's not like messed, it's not already tainted. Your ability to use it isn't already tainted by other phase manipulated relationships by like another EQ or a different dynamics processor along the way. Does that make sense?
Yep, it does, and hopefully, guys, you understood that too. All right, so we've got multiband, we've got AR, TG mastering. Let's see what this does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, we started with the multiband, then I made an adjustment here to compensate a little bit and also give us a little bit more meat in the EQ. We're going to do more EQing in a second here, but I turned off all of the these processes. I actually meant to just turn on the compressor, limiter, the dynamics process here at the end first, because this is going to be our first section of like really good light dynamics processing, and that's going to be the first process of that. And so that's what I want to look at first here. So I'm going to turn the plugin on, then you'll see me just turn off these little buttons here, which will show you that the compressor is on or the EQ is on, whatever. So compressor off right now, just where we're at the moment is this. So what we've got here is we've given it a little bit of gain. You're going to see that I am not actually adding a ton of gain for each thing along the way. I think the mix is already close to loud enough. We're not going to have a huge difference here. But what we are going to have is the kick drum, the bass, and the vocal intelligibility should all kind of come up in level. What you're not going to want to have is to have anything feel like it's pumping or squashed or anything weird like that, like a bad byproduct. And so in order to do that, I have to give a little bit of runway to this compressor and take out some of the work that it's having to do. So in this area down around 350, 400 hertz, I'm pulling down a little bit of level for the filter for this particular limiter. And I've chosen, for this song, I find that modern on number 3 for the recovery feels the most natural and feels the most even in order to give it a little bit of gain. And so you can see you got some parallel work going on here, a little bit of makeup gain, nothing too crazy here. This is a very light compression situation because we're doing in mastering. We're not doing a lot of compression. We mostly, I mostly add gain along the way rather than pulling down a whole bunch of stuff and then pulling down a whole bunch of dynamics and then adding a whole bunch of makeup gain at the end. I just like to give it a little bit of gain each step of the way. And I find that that gives me not only a lot more control, but it also makes the song feel a lot more natural and open. We're also going to have a look real quick at this EQ. So this guy is here, and I found that as soon as I started adding any dynamics processing, I had this sort of like kind of like honkiness happening in the vocal. And so I pulled down a little bit of this 724. I gave back, you can see, like, for the most part, whenever I'm pulling down stuff, I'm also giving back weight in other areas. It's just one thing you got to pay attention to is you can subtract and you can add, but you really should add and subtract in different places.
Right.
Okay. So
you're making it sound great.
Well, thank you. And this was just a very fast, quick master, that we set up in the little sound check here. So this may not be perfect, but it's pretty good, I think. Good start. So we turn that off.
The world is in your eyes.
So for me, that EQ just sort of opens up. It just sort of ends up feeling a little bit more natural. The vocal I never want the vocal to feel like she's having, like, she might be singing really hard, but like not able to get up over the band.
Right.
That's one thing. And then this little filter for me is really just a little bit of compensation for this tape emulation, tape equalizer emulator thing here. So again, we go over here and it's still in MS. And so I'm going to turn these both on and off together so you can get a proper visual or proper like understanding of what's happening. So those are off right now.
The world
Wow.
is in your eyes. I hear a voice in the shadows. See
Okay. Then we're going to save this as MPA. Awesome. Sure. Okay. So let's see. Lastly, one thing that this is so funny because I love this freaking plugin so much. I personally think that it kind of sounds better and it's maybe more flexible for me anyway than my hardware 2500. So I use this thing constantly. And in this case, it's kind of rare because it's actually in this particular case, it's actually at the end of the chain. And usually it shows up kind of right after my multiband when I'm mastering stuff in the box. But in this case, I found that it worked better to help us give a little bit more analog glue feeling and give us a little bit more of a cohesive soundstage. And it just feels like everything feels like just a lot more glued together and anchored for me with this in the end of the chain. And, I know I get asked all the time, does it matter if you EQ or compress first? Yes, it matters. It will sound different. And so for this, I find that it sounds best here. So we'll turn that on and then I'll turn it off. I'm not adding a ton of gain, but this is where you're going to have some actual gain addition. So keep an eye on your levels here. I'll just warn you. So here it is.
the world is in your
Off.
eyes. I hear a voice in the shadows.
It adds some thump, doesn't it?
It does add some bump, and actually I'm not really liking the recovery of this right now. So I'm gonna raise that a hair and see if that kind of fixes things, and then I'm gonna lower it a hair and see if that fixes things.
The world is in
Oh, I like that better. That feels better already. Yeah, it
Me
was
too.
I was getting a little bit of pumping.
So while we're talking
So-
about that loudness, Thomas has asked. He says, "I suppose loudness normalization for streaming platforms is done after mastering." I think I mean, how does that work?
Well, you're not going to normalize anything in particular in the mastering process. I mean, you're going to end up with an output level that is appropriate for streaming services. And although the encoding and like the algorithms that the streaming services are using changes, like seems like every month, Spotify sounds different or iTunes sounds a little bit different, but the actual like level for the guidelines of like what is too loud and will get turned down based on the normalization schemes that most of the services have out there, we have a target that we have to hit. And so when I'm mastering this, I'm looking at my meters sitting in front of me, and I know where responsibly loud and what will sound good in all these streaming services is going to be. But I would say if you are aiming for something around minus 14 LUFS, you're probably going to be in good shape. There are also a couple of other really cool tools out there available on the internet. If you just look up like loudness penalty metering or LUFS meters, that will show you something that has has the streaming service guidelines in there. So it'll tell you like how much it'll turn down based on if you're sending it to Spotify or iTunes or YouTube.
We have a really good one. It's called WLM Plus.
Sure do.
And we just added a couple of streaming service presets into that as well. So
Yep. So that's basically, you're looking for a target. You're not looking for a specific normalization or anything like that. If you're above 0, you're going to be clipping off information. You don't want to be doing that anyway. But what you really want to be looking for is a responsible target, and that is usually I'm searching for something around minus 14 LUFS.
right.
That's just
Okay.
me in the way that I master records. Other people will have other recommendations.
But this is all useful information for people who are trying to do this at home as well. So before we go on, I have a question here from Christian. What does Piper mean when she says a high-frequency limiter might potentially be the first plugin in the chain? How is this different from any other limiter in the usual context?
Well, it's something that's going to go really, really, really fast and catch really fast transients that I would think are almost like a smearing sound and end up feeling like they're going to be fatiguing. And so it will kind of just tame that a little bit without actually lowering or taking off any of the actual like top end EQ level. It just makes it feel less like grating. That would be something very similar, like not exactly the same as how a de-esser works, but similar, like a similar role, except for instead of being a de-esser where you're trying to probably attack the vocal, or you're trying to attack like the grating hi-hat or something like that, it would be something that's it's going to be adjusting a little bit higher up and full spectrum on the mix.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. Now we're going to go on to the last plugin that's staring at me in the face, the L1, which is one of the oldest plugins we have that we created. And this plugin arguably was one of the ones responsible for the loudness wars. Okay, so what are we doing with the L1 here?
So this L1 is just super, super fast. Very, very basic little threshold adjustment here. I could leave this at 0 and be fine. I pulled it down to -5 because I just wanted a tiny bit more level out of this thing, like just a hair. And then the output ceiling is just set for -3. So it's basically, this is just a little safety limiter. So if I get really like crazy, and decide that I want to jack up the output level, the manual makeup gain on this 2500, I can get a good understanding of what's going to happen without clipping the output of the master bus. And then it's just, again, it's just a little safety limiter. It's just.
And what about the auto release?
What's that?
What about the auto release that you've got off right now? It's like, I mean, what? I
want it to be set as fast as possible, and for me, I try and be as intentional as possible. And one thing I learned from Mr. Bob Cass was never turn your back on computers or technology. And so I want to be in control all the time of this release, the release timing. And I just think that the way that this one sounds right now, it sounds better with the auto release off.
Beautiful. There was a couple of people who had asked, so I thought I'd get that one in there. Okay, so let's hear what you're doing with this, because then we're going to move on, folks, to prepping your stuff for a mastering engineer. So what are we doing here, Piper?
Basically nothing. It's just literally a safety limiter. You probably won't hear it at all. That's off.
The world is in your eyes.
Yeah.
One thing
I
will
think
say
the only
is
thing
that-
person who hears it is me, because it's my track and I know it so intimately.
But here's the thing, Michael, and this is the reason why I chose this one and also chose to use a tiny, tiny bit of threshold. I chose to give it a little bit of, like, feed the plugin a little bit, is because I personally like the sound of careful limiting to adjust the width in a soundstage rather than using a stereo widener knob. I personally like the feeling of a little bit of limiting here and there, which will actually open up the stereo image a little bit, create a little bit of depth and sometimes a little bit of height. So sitting here in the mastering room, I can hear when this thing gets turned on and off, because I actually feel the stereo image kind of go, whoop, just kind of inflates just a little bit. You want to try that? See if you guys can hear that real quick. So it's off.
The world is in your eyes. I hear a voice in my shadow.
And the reason why it for me, I like the sound of that is because it brings up the really low level, like the little tiny reverbs. It brings up the little tiny, are those little tablas or something, the little percussion-y drum sounds that are so low level in the mix and in the master that when you put a limiter on there, it just kicks them up a little bit. And usually those things are on the side. So it actually ends up feeling like the sides kind of come up a little bit more and creates this beautiful width. But it's really natural. It's way more natural than grabbing a stereo width knob and just cranking it to change the phase relationship between the speakers. It's way more natural feeling to just do it with a very basic broadband dynamics process that will just kick up the level of those little tiny sounds, therefore making the whole mix sound bigger and wider.
There's actually a couple of questions here. Marcus and another few people have been asking about saturation plugins in mastering, but I think you actually just answered that, because that's kind of like, that's
Similar
spread
idea.
as well. Yeah,
Yep.
similar idea. Okay, so so we've got the Lin multiband, we've got the Abbey Road TG mastering stereo, we've got the Lin EQ API 2500 stereo, which has the best makeup gain on any compressor I've ever experienced. I think it's brilliant. Are you using
awesome.
the makeup gain in this one, or is it turned?
Heck yeah.
I didn't think so. I didn't. Yeah.
No, I am here.
You are.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I always
there
like to
you go.
set that. I always like to set that to manual. Again, there are some times when auto is cool, but this one in particular, I think it's good to set a manual gain and keep it there.
No, it's like, it sounds amazing. Thank you. It's like I'll pay the money to get this mastered by you. Everybody else is taking snapshots of the screen right now and going, okay, right, what do I use?
You want me to put it back?
Oh, that's fine. Okay,
There you
so
Okay.
Josh wants to know, everybody applies a high pass filter around 30 hertz. Do you use a low
no.
pass filter at all, or?
We don't. Not everybody applies a low pass filter or a high pass filter around 30 hertz. You can see I do not have any high pass filters going on in this master whatsoever. I personally don't like the sound of high pass filters, most of them. There are some that I like and that we have to use for getting vinyl, getting ready to cut lacquer for vinyl production. And that is, personally, I find that if I need to cut something in the low end, I'm going to reach for a bell instead of an actual full-on high-pass filter, because I find that it just sounds better higher up the frequency spectrum, personally.
Okay, so I have two last questions before we move into the last section. Firstly, everybody wants to know what headphones that you like.
I like whatever headphones feel good on my head, to be honest. Most headphones are head crushers. I've been using the Sennheiser HD 280s for like my whole career, even from when I was in school. And so these ones always feel like they give me the best isolation, and that they don't totally feel like they're gonna, they're hurting my neck or my head or anything like that. And I like the sound of them. Some people don't think they have enough bass. I personally know that when I feel like there's too much bass in these, then there's really way too much bass out in the world.
Right.
So I like these. I love the Odysseys. I do like the ATH M50s. I think those are fantastic headphones. They just don't really fit my head all that well. So I like my trusty old 280s, and I feel like I can't break them. Like they're just solid.
Yeah, it's like this pair of headphones has been with me for about 10 years, and I think they're molded to my ears now.
Yeah.
Another question.
I also evangelized a little bit at the beginning, open back headphones. So I love the 650s. I have a couple of pairs of those that I totally love as well.
I guess it's like speakers. As long as you really know what you're listening to, then that's a help. Now, there's another couple of people who are saying, how do you feel about plugins that put you in a virtual room like NX or Abbey Road Studio 3, using that in headphones? Is like that something that you feel one way or the other about?
Yeah, I feel like the more tools that we have that are like that, the better they're going to get. And like I've used the NX stuff, absolutely. And even for like experimenting with spatial audio and all that too, it's a really powerful tool. And I think it does incredible job by approximating the environment that you want to be in. For me, I just prefer to just have a regular old stereo, pair of headphones sitting there around my head when I absolutely need them. I don't wear headphones all that much because I am, I am lucky enough to have access to a good sounding room, so I prefer to do that. But
Are
for
those
editing,
PMCs I can see in the bottom picture? Are those are PMCs? Is that a PMC I see in the
Yeah.
bottom webcam? Yeah, that's what I thought.
that is, that's the pair of BB5 XBDs made by PMC that we have here in the Nashville studio. And I have a pair just like this, but they're in a cherry finish in my studio in Oakland. And then we have another pair of these as well in the Infrasonic LA studio.
So while we're moving, we're going to use this as a segue now, and I'm going to keep you for another 20 minutes or so because everybody's been digging this. Somebody just asked, what's some philosophy about mixing for vinyl compared to mastering or mixing and mastering for vinyl compared to mixing and mastering for digital delivery. Do they differ at all? Seeming as you obviously have a vinyl side as well that you work with.
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's really, really awesome that vinyl has made such a huge comeback. Obviously artists and man, listeners, anybody holding a physical piece of music in their hands not only benefits the artists and the bottom line of the project, it also gives the artists and the listeners a way of expressing and listening, and seeing and holding and looking at visual representation of that art. Vinyl is a really, really hard thing to get right. I know because I've spent a lot of years in it, and I've spent a lot of years trying to open a vinyl record pressing plant. And there is so much that goes into making a vinyl record that has to go correctly in order for it to even show up as sound on the disc. And so the first step is recording and mixing in such a way that will sound good eventually on vinyl. And you're totally right to ask that question. There are things that you should be doing in your mix if you think that your record is going to be destined for vinyl. Number one, make sure that any top end stuff that you've got going, like really splashy cymbals, any samples that you have that have like a hard start and a hard stop, that you're not having things like a lot of like clicky sounds, glitchy sounds that are not made by an analog instrument. Computers can make those sounds and make them happen really, really fast. A lathe on a turntable is not as adaptable as a computer is. And so things like super, super low sub bass or things that are out of phase in the low end are problems, but really more problems turn out to be things that have a lot of really crazy top end stuff happening, we have to band pass that, or we have to use very heavy high frequency limiters to be able to just control that enough so that the cutting stylus can actually do its job without getting having the heads get too hot, or having the actual waveform not get cut properly.
Wow.
So when you're mixing, watch your level, try and make sure that there is some dynamics available in program dynamics and dynamic range. Make sure that you don't have too much crazy top end going on. Listen to your mastering engineer. If you ask them what they think it should need, then listen to them and do that, please. But yeah, the normal things are like, make sure that there's not too much crazy sub bass. Try to make sure that the bass is as mono compatible as possible. If it's not, it's okay. We have tools to do that, to make sure we have elliptical filters and things to make sure that it's going to sound as good as it can. But bigger problems end up being high frequency issues and overall level issues. And when you're going to get ready to sequence a vinyl record, keep in mind that things that are on the end of the sides tend to be a little bit harder to cut loud and bright. They end up feeling a little bit off if you treated them the same way all the way across. That's why a lot of ballads used to be put on the ends of records, on the ends of the sides, back then.
I didn't know that. That's so cool. So
yeah, the sequence really matters.
Tone generator. Somebody just mentioned it's like a lot of people are noticing you have a tone generator on your chain. Do you use this to calibrate? Do you have any tips on calibration of speakers and headphones before starting to prepare for mastering or for their own mastering?
Yeah, this is just a simple little tone gen that I have set for -18 1K. There's a ton of different ones you can use. I just always have this one set up on my little mastering template here. And every day before I start my work, I just go through and make sure that the system is working properly. So I send a -18 tone through all the gear, turn it all on, turn it all off, make sure that left is left and right is right through every piece of gear. And that when I'm feeding -18 into the mastering chain, that I get -18 back, and no deviation, even up to 1/10 of a dB is kind of not really perfect in my book. So then I will send out a -18 tone and then pick up a meter in the digital realm on the other side and make sure that I'm getting -18 back. So
That's
it's
cool.
just like a way of making sure that the system is working properly. I would hate to have, spent an entire day mastering a record only to realize that like the right channel was a 0.5 dB down. I mean, that would be horrible. I'd have to do all that work again, and then I'm not really worth my salt if I'm not paying attention.
This is true. So, okay. So we're now talking about sending music to a mastering engineer. Now, first question I have, which is probably a really quick answer. We were just talking about stuff that I knew nothing about, which was the difference in mixing for vinyl. I'm going to take a stab in the dark and say that the mix I sent you was too hot for vinyl.
No, not too hot. There's a little bit extra top end stuff happening that I would probably say like, hey, Michael, is it okay if I tame that a little bit? It's going to sound a little bit different when you go to proof your mix, or proof your master, but it'll actually translate onto the lacquer much better. So in that case, I think that this would be fine. This mix would be fine to end up being mastered for vinyl and go onto the lathe. And bring back a beautiful sounding song on vinyl. I don't think there's anything wrong with your overall level here. And the reason is because like even when you zoom in, like I'm not seeing crazy squared off waveforms. I'm not seeing issues with like housekeeping issues with like samples being cut off or like having crazy glitches or anything. All the waveforms look really natural, and that's what the lathe wants to see. So
question on that. So let's take, for example, the Black and White album from Michael Jackson. It was crazy digital, lots of glitching and stuff. How would that have been hard to stick on vinyl? Because I think they did back then. In fact, I think I owned it, but it's like, is that the kind of stuff that turns up looking square, like little high-rise buildings when you zoom in?
a square, like a squared off, or I mean, even something that is actually a square wave is still just a square wave. Like that's not the problem. It's just that nowadays we have all these crazy tools, or literally just like bad housekeeping habits that end up with songs that come out of the digital workstation that have glitches that no lathe and no analog process can really replicate. So that
Gotcha.
album was
Okay.
probably all that glitching and stuff was probably created with real electronic instruments and electronic tools, which in that case is real analog waveform. That's not a problem. The issue is
Okay.
when a computer can't express the waveform correctly, that ends up sounding like it sounds like a glitch to us, but when it goes into the vinyl process, it ends up sounding really nasty, like sounds terrible. You never want that.
Gotcha. Phil wants to know why Reaper? Why are you using Reaper?
Ooh, that's a good question, Phil. I like Reaper because it's really flexible. It sounds great. It always works. It always turns on. It's not terribly expensive. And it has the ability to play back plugins. Like, let's just say I have this little effects here, which were both turned off, by the way. But if I wanted to say turn one of them off, or something, if I had to edit this track and like maybe this verse had a really SE sound, I could put a de-esser on and it'll just play through seamlessly. I can use different IO. So when I had a different a different D to A from my A to D, I could use Reaper that way. I didn't have to have only one A to D and D to A. I could use different inputs and outputs. There's a million reasons why I like Reaper. You can use effects before the recording, after the recording. You can do crazy internal sending. Like, I don't think I would have been able to set up this session the way that I have it and as flexible as I do without, in another workstation. There's just a bunch of crazy routing going on, even just to do this Zoom call. And then also to still have everything show up on the console the way I'm used to seeing it.
Right. Next one on this one is somebody is asking, actually a few people, Fabio is one of them. G'day, Fabio. He's saying there seems to be a pattern now that, or he's heard of, that people are sending stems to a mastering engineer. Now, I know you, so I know how you feel about that, but you tell everybody else how you feel about that.
Sure. So stems have a place. They have a place in, if that music in particular is going to be put into visual media of some sort, they might need that kind of flexibility for stems. If you are not 100% confident with your mix or your mixing engineer, you might ask them for stems so that someone else could make an adjustment in the future if you feel like you need to. Stems are also for instance, like, say we have a high profile project that comes in that's really, really last minute and the artist, again, isn't super stoked on their mix, then they might want us to master from stems to have a little bit more flexibility in the mastering process. But really, I believe that your mix is your mix, and I'm here to master your mix. I'm not here to finish your mix by using your stems to master it. And like I said, there are times that mastering from stems is necessary, and there are times that it's totally welcome, and it usually ends up costing more money in the long run. It's a lot easier to make a slight adjustment in your mix after a free consultation than it is to create stems. Now, here's the thing. The reason I came to this decision about stems is because they turned out to be more of a pain in the butt than they're worth for the most part. Stems are not the easiest thing to create unless you really, really know what you're doing. So here's what I want you to remember. The sum of your stems equals your mix. So if I add up all the stems and play them, and then play the mix in the same workstation but out of phase, you should hear nothing. And 9 times out of 10, when somebody sends me stems, I go to do that simple null test, and the stems and the mix doesn't null, so that I know that those stems aren't really what the stereo mix is intended to be. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, it does. So there you go. There you go, folks. So if you want to try that at home, you actually can try that at home. Mix out stems and then bounce off the track and see if they phase each other out. So, okay. So you've asked me for a mix, a vocal up, vocal down and I sent you with compression and without compression, as well as the instrumental. Why did you want an instrumental as a mastering engineer from the artist?
Well, because Michael, I think that this song is going places, and I definitely could like see this in like the next Fast and Furious movie, or maybe when Harry Met Sally 2 or something. This is a beautiful song, but also has great energy. So I think that this could get picked up by some sort of visual media conglomerate. And in that case, they're going to want your instrumental version of the song mastered, because a lot of times what they'll do is they'll cut back and forth between the full with vocal and then the instrumental, based on different parts of parts of whatever the scene is. And in that case, they need to play seamlessly through. So in this moment, it's better to master the instrumental at the same time as we're mastering the full version. Also, it gives me an understanding of like what else is happening in the mix when the vocal's gone. So sometimes it informs a little bit, but for the most part, it's really just a good responsible thing for me to ask for. If I think that you might be seeking sync opportunities, we should master the song instrumental as well right now.
Okay, well, I'm glad you like it, and I'm also glad there's going to be yet another Fast and Furious. All right, so what's next?
So next thing, I was hoping to just give you a quick A/B of the mix as you sent it, and then pop in this little stereo in the box master. And then I was hoping to just run through what it would be like to master this on the console.
That's fine with me. You tell me when you want me to mute your microphone.
Cool. So I'm just gonna I'm just gonna turn off on our little master chain in the box here, and then when I turn it off, I'll tell you to mute me, and then I'll do the master actually on the console as if I were mastering this myself right now.
Which is why we have the third camera, folks.
This one. So here we go. Here's I'll just turn this on and off at different sections.
This piano melody has been stuck in my head for years.
Don't say goodbye. Don't make me cry. Oh.
We'll skip to another section here.
Eyes. The world is in your eyes. I hear a voice in the shadows. See your face in the crowd.
Okay.
Cool.
So that gives us a little bit of an understanding of what we can do in the box. And then here I'm going to do this song as if I were to sit down and master it right now. So in this case, I'm sorry I keep scrolling around because I've got I've got the Zoom here right in front of me, so it's kind of hard to see. So now I'm going to pull this out onto the console and pop in the gear, and I'll just talk a little bit about it real fast before I start messing with it. But you'll see the mastering console itself is over here. It's a Maselec MTC1. There is, I'm using 5 of the 6 available inserts, and we have some gear that's chained together to make up the inserts. The way most mastering consoles work is very much like a patch bay on a traditional mixing console. It's just that all the gear is always plugged into these specific insert points, and I use them and pull them in and out as I need. So you'll see me kind of popping buttons around on here. Right now we've got the UTC transformers. We've got a back CQ. We have a NIF Soma. We have Mog Magnum K comps and an EQ4. We have the Portico, Rupert Neve Designs Portico Master Bus Processor, and we have a totally tricked out stereo Very-Mu limiter compressor by Manley. There's also a pair of, you can't see it down here, but there's a pair of Spectrasonics comp limiters, although I think they should have called them the complementers, because I think that would have been a better marketing ploy. And then we've also got a secret little box down here, which is a high frequency limiter. So all that gear is what's being used here, and I will just kind of start mastering, and I'll pop back and forth between just what the mix sounded like and what the master sounded like, and then maybe we can compare it to our crazy little digital master version. What do you think?
All right. You tell me when you want me to mute you.
Okay. Mute me now.
Okay, here we go. Muting Piper so that you don't hear the bleed through the microphone. Yep, we're good to go, Piper. So the beautiful thing about mastering is it's an art form that's very different to mixing. So this is a really good example for all of you of what actually happens behind those curtains.
The music of this dance is the well-known two-step.
Don't say goodbye. Don't make me cry. Oh, fading again, but I won't give in to the world. Is in your eyes. The world is in your eyes. I hear a voice in the shadows. See your face in the crowd. Baby, don't say goodbye, no. Baby, don't say goodbye, no. Baby, my heart's breaking, scared to lose it again. Baby.
Your microphone's back on.
Cool. So I just created, kind of a very, very quick, basic mastering. I had dialed this in a little bit before we got started today, and I just kind of verified some of my settings, changed a few things. But I'll just tell you really, really fast where we're at, and then you'll see me kind of turn off all the gear and then turn it all back on so you can hear. We've got the UTCs in 2-to-1. We've got a little bit of MS, so we're adding a little bit of width just on the we are adding just a little bit of the mid to get a little bit more intelligibility out of the vocal by like 0.4 dB, nothing crazy. The backs EQ, we are at so no shelves, no cuts, but the shelves are set at 98 plus 2 clicks, and 7.1 plus 2 clicks. The NIF Soma, we're sitting on the top end, plus 1 click at 4K7, plus 1 click at 2K2, and plus 1 click at 150, and plus 1 click at 68, all medium cues. The Rupert Neve Designs is doing a parallel process, and that's about 75% blend, sidechain 125 hertz at 1.5, 1.5 to 1 as the ratio, threshold all the way open. Tiny bit of gain on this. You'll hear this is the biggest gain adder, as well as the Very kind of a medium attack, fairly fast release, using about 60% red silk, no limiter on, and a tiny bit of LF depth and a tiny bit of HM width. And then the Very kind of like a threshold is just kind of kissing it. We are set to compress mode, not limit. And we're adding a little bit of gain here with a pretty fast attack, or pretty fast release and a pretty slow attack. And then no other gain added. And then a tiny, on the console, little tiny bit of gain, just kissing these Spectrasonics. The Mog EQ, giving it a little bit of sub, tiny bit of 40, pulling out a tiny bit of 160, giving it a little bit of 650 and nothing at the 2.5K. And then doing a little bit of mid-high frequency limiting on the little bit of compression on the 2.5, 2.7K area of the K comp.
I'm totally geeking out right now.
Nothing crazy.
I'm totally geeking out right now. That's
so
awesome.
I figured you'd want to know.
Yeah.
So I'm going to play the mix real quick, and then I'm going to pop all the master chain back in. And then you'll see me come over here and I'll play the mix again. And then I'll put our little plugin version on. Okay.
Okay. You want me to mute you again?
Here, the next thing that would happen is we basically would record. So we would essentially just start a recording and record this master in. So we then at that point have created a completely new recording through the analog gear. And then we use that as the master that goes out into the world.
Cool.
Okay. So one more time. Here comes our
muting you.
Cool. Mix.
Here we go.
This dance is the well-known two-step.
Don't say goodbye. Don't make me cry. Fading again.
Wow.
But I won't give in to
You want me to turn you back on? You're live.
All right. Could we understand what was happening there?
Yeah, we could.
So smiley, Michael.
Huh?
You're so smiley.
I am so smart. Well, I mean, I realized halfway through this, I'm technically getting my work mastered live online. There's a question that's coming up a lot, and I'm going to get it in before I forget. People want to know how you feel about some of the online AI-driven mastering services right now. I mean, obviously, there's no comparison to a mastering engineer, but have you got any thoughts on that? Because the questions come up quite a lot, apparently.
Yeah, of course. I think that any of those tools are totally applicable and useful for the right thing. I mean, I'd be stupid to tell you that they're going to be, they're going to take over my job or something, because I think that would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But even though those things have been out in the world for a long time, they haven't impacted my life in any way. In fact, I often get a lot of calls that say I had, XYZ online or robot mastering service did my master, and now I got to pay you to redo it because it didn't turn out great. I think that there are some things on the horizon that are going to be amazing and are going to sound great. But I don't think that that really is going to affect my day-to-day world as an analog, real-time, real person mastering engineer. I think that those services are good for people that have massive music libraries or are trying to look for sync opportunities or are just simply prolific songwriters that have no reason to have their demos mastered in real time by a real person. It makes sense for them to have a, quote, pseudo master or a quick demo master done. Right. That's totally fine. But I don't think there's any replacement for a proper human being working on your stuff. Now, humans make mistakes. So do, the humans that make those products. And so if you have to have a company or a person that's making that product to be as good as it possibly can, and I think there's no replacement for human experience.
No, that's absolutely true. So before we close out, if there was one piece of advice you could give people, two questions actually. First one, if there's one piece of advice you would give to someone who was at home, self-quarantining, in lockdown, trying to do a master of their own work, if there was one strong piece of advice, what would it be?
Make sure that what you're attempting is actually what you're getting. So for me, I always try and have a goal that I'm trying to get to before I even start the process. So, you never jump in the car and start driving usually without a destination, right? So same idea. And I think the rest of the team is going to come visit here in a second, just to say hi and sign off. But I think that the biggest thing that we can do is have a goal and know where this thing is trying to go before you even start. So use references, use mixed references, use mastering references, and then just try as much as possible to be responsible and know that we aren't usually super heavy-handed in the mastering process. So if you're making adjustments in the EQ of more than 3, 4, 5 dB at a time, you're probably in remix territory. So that's my advice.
Okay, and now last question before you bring in the team. If you have one piece of advice to give to people who are prepping their music and mixing their music to send it to someone like you, a mastering engineer, a world-class mastering engineer like you, what would it be?
Make sure that you give me enough tops and tails. Make sure that your waveforms are not clipped off. So make sure that you are being very responsible about your gain. And then make sure that your fades are done correctly, and try and, have a conversation with the engineer first. And if you don't like the master, let us know and let us know what you need to make it right. The worst feeling in the world is when you think that you've done a good job and then maybe you haven't. So it's all conversation, especially when you're working with someone new. You have to develop that language and that workflow to be able to make incredible projects.
This is true. So, okay, so do you have anybody there who wants to? Is Catherine there?
Yeah. Hey guys, come here.
So remember, folks, this is not a huge gathering.
And
these
also,
as they said at the
mastering,
beginning, these people test all the time, and they are super healthy and super safe.
Here's the thing that you guys got to know too, is that mastering studios, for the most part, don't work with one person in a room in a vacuum. We are a whole team of people here. There's Pete, there's Dan, there's Ray, our manager. There's Catherine back there heading up the archive world, and we all work together and try and we're all one big happy family. And so without all these guys here, it would be really, really hard to make something like this happen. So I just have to say thanks, and I love you guys. Yeah.
And you're all healthy, right? So, and that's
We're all
the
healthy.
really happy thing. Yeah.
We've been tested.
You're all tested. It's all been tested.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
well,
We're one
listen,
little close-knit family unit.
the Waves family thanks you, Piper. You're freaking awesome. Guys, thanks, Pete. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everybody. I would like to say on behalf of everybody who's been watching this has been a super fun Waves Open Sessions. Piper, say goodbye to the world. I'm going to say goodbye to the world, and we will close out.
Goodbye, world. Thanks,
Take
Michael.
care, everybody.
Waves.
See you next week.
You guys.
Bye.
The